I think we'll begin. Wonderful to have you all here and to see you coming from alle Ecken von der Welt, every corner of the world. You're here today for a wonderful tour of an exhibit called Living Yiddish in New York, an exhibit that's on at the Jewish Theological Seminary here in New York. And it's all about Yiddish becoming a center, a cultural center, New York becoming a cultural center of Yiddish in late 19th, early 20th centuries, and using artifacts from the Jewish Theological Seminary's collection to tell the story of how it became such a center and of the Yiddish-speaking populace of New York in that period and all of their cultural activity. And the guest curator of that exhibit is Annie Cohen. Annie is a friend of mine and also a wonderful historian and Yiddish teacher and performer. She is a doctoral student at Jewish Theological Seminary, where the exhibit is, at the library of the Jewish Theological Seminary. She's studying modern Jewish history and writing her dissertation on the Jewish left, and some of the exhibit focuses on that movement as well. And Annie also has a wonderful blog called pullingatthreads.com, where she uncovers forgotten ritual practices of women. And Annie is at the same time studying to become a practicer of ritual herself in the Kohenet program, which trains people to serve the Jewish community through ritual and spirituality. Annie comes from London and is here in New York now and is wonderful all around and is going to take us on a wonderful tour of this exhibit. Yeah, that's all I'll say. I'll say one more thing, which is just that all of Annie's talents were on display at the opening of this exhibit, which took place a month or so ago. And Annie, as the guest curator, was there, of course, managing things and giving tours of the exhibit, but then also popped up in front of the band Isle of Klesbos to sing a couple of songs with them. And I thought, what a marvelous display of Annie's talents that she's put together this whole exhibit, drawing on all of her knowledge and expertise and creativity, and then also has a wonderful voice and is able to come up in front of a klezmer band and do some songs of the period. So that was really wonderful, and I'm glad she's here to lead us on this tour today. So thank you, Annie.
Thank you, Michal. I'm glad that you're hosting this, especially since we'll be talking a little bit about the Yiddish theater, and you are one of the stars of today's Yiddish stage in New York. As you can see, I am in the exhibition space. I will try not to drehen euch die Kep, but I'll do a little twirl so you can see the space. And I am then going to walk over to where I can charge my laptop to make sure that it doesn't die during the presentation. And I'll be giving you the tour in the form of a PowerPoint. So hopefully those of you who can read and understand a bit of Yiddish will be able to read some of the materials yourselves. And I'll be reading and translating them. Just share my screen. Okay. This in presenter mode.
And I'll say to everyone that if you have questions, please put them in the chat for us, or you can put them in the Q&A, I think. And at the end of the presentation, we'll get to your questions and Annie will answer them for you.
Yes, thank you. Please do ask questions and make comments. I am going to get bored of the sound of my own voice, and I'm sure you all will as well. So here's a better picture of the exhibition space, this beautiful design, which I'm not responsible for. My job really on this was to go through JTS's Yiddish collections and identify what items could we use for this exhibition. And this was also a very important and, for me, fun exercise in documenting what Yiddish collections the Jewish Theological Seminary has, and that's an ongoing project. But for this exhibition, this was made possible by a very generous donation. The donor gave a beautiful speech at the opening event, which Michal was also at, about her father's connection to Yiddish and dedication to Yiddish culture in New York. So we knew that was what she really wanted, was to bring this alive for the people who come to see the exhibition. A lot of people who are engaged already with what the Workers' Circle does in New York and other organizations like the Volksbühne will already be familiar with this history, but a lot of people aren't. And so the first thing we really tried to show was just how important New York is as a center of Yiddish culture. There is a reason that I, as a historian from London, have come to study in New York. Here at JTS, I speak to my PhD supervisor, Professor David Fishman, in Yiddish, which is not something I'm able to do everywhere. Could do it in a few other places, but not everywhere. And so with this exhibition, we kind of tried to tell that story a little bit of how did New York become this place. You can see on the left, the very first item in the exhibition as you come in is this biography of Benjamin Franklin, Benjamin Franklin's Lebensbeschreibung und die Befreiung von Amerika, the liberation of America. And this was printed in Warsaw. This is the only, I think, I should know this. I'm pretty sure that this is the only item in the exhibit that was not published here in New York. And we included this. There were quite a few things like this, quite a few different books on American history, American heroes, produced by the Workers' Circle. In the JTS collections, but we included this one to give people a sense of the attraction of America, the Eastern European Jews at the end of the 19th century. So it's often said, and it to some extent is true, or believed, that all Jews who came to America from Eastern Europe came here fleeing pogroms. That story exists to some extent. That is true. A lot of people, though, it wasn't just a story of running away from something, it was running to something, this dream of this Republican country where everybody is, at least in theory, equal. Everyone has equality of opportunity. At this point in Eastern Europe, most Jews are still living in the Russian Empire, confined to the Pale of Settlement, not able to access things like higher education or certain careers. Jews in Russia did not gain citizenship until the 1917 revolution. So this land, this story was very attractive to people. And we're going to talk a lot actually, in fact, about both the reality of that, the extent to which America lived up to that ideal, and the extent to which it did not, and what that meant for the founders of the Workers' Circle. On the right, you can see this journal, this Yiddish journal, Das Neue Land. This is actually one of two journals that we've got on display that was edited by the very famous Yiddish writer Avram Reisen. It's very tiny, so probably hard to make out, but there are some very big names in there: Sholem Ash, I'm Bialik. So many great Yiddish writers came to New York whether some of them lived and died here. Sholem Aleichem is buried here in New York. Raisin is buried here in New York. But many spent time here during this period, attracted by many different things, but to a great extent just by the freedom, the freedom of publishing, the freedom of creativity that America offered, and New York, being home to so many Jewish immigrants, quickly became a very important center of that. New York was also home to the very first popular Yiddish press. I think by 1897, perhaps even earlier, there were 3 Yiddish dailies being published in New York. That's more than anywhere else in the world, more than in Eastern Europe. I diligently, this is a postcard. This is one of many Yiddish postcards that JTS has in its collection with names of Yiddish Zeitungen in America. You can see that here Yiddish means Jewish, not just Yiddish, although most of them are Yiddish. There's no date on this, but I think this must be from some of the titles, this must be at least the 20s already. But I actually went through all of the Yiddish titles on this postcard, and I can tell you that almost all of them were published in New York. This was a very, very important center of Jewish publishing and creativity. Here's an example of one of the publications we've got on display. We're going to look a bit at the picture and the cartoon here. This is to me, so there's a few Londoners here, so you're Englanders here, so you'll know what I'm talking about. To me, this seems like the Yiddish private eye. I asked some Americans in a tour group, and they said it's kind of like the Yiddish Mad magazine. I don't know if you agree. Der Größer Kundes, the big prankster, called in Yiddish the Big Stick, was produced by someone called Yosef Tunkel, a very famous Yiddish satirist. And this was a satirical magazine in New York. And as I said, we're going to come back to this picture, which is one of the many examples of the ways that Yiddish-speaking Jews in New York satirized and kind of criticized the American dream. This is this is an extremely rare publication, one of a few that I found while I was going through the collections, Der Id. I've not found any other example, any other exemplar of this newspaper, having gone through kind of different archives. Perhaps someone here knows it. If you do, please do let me know. This claims to be the first Zionist newspaper printed in New York. It's you might be able to see the date. It's from 1905. It describes the very first Zionist demonstration in New York City. It talks about the death of Theodor Herzl, and this is very interesting as well, because it doesn't appear to be associated with Poale Zion or the left Zionist movement that we usually associate Yiddish with. This is just a mainstream Zionist newspaper. It writes about things that are happening in Palestine, issues with the World Zionist Congress. It also talks about Jewish culture, and there's a very I found very funny, sweet article that says it's against English. It's pro Yiddish and Hebrew, but it says Jewish culture cannot be expressed in English, and especially Jewish humor. You can only express Jewish humor in Yiddish or Hebrew. So this is kind of also an example of one of the many different groups of Jewish immigrants in New York who were really determined to maintain Yiddish culture. And we're going to quickly get to the worker circle. This is a worker circle event, or a joint worker circle event, and talk about our role in that. I'm sure everyone recognizes this newspaper, Der Vorwärts. We didn't have any earlier examples, so most of the items in the exhibition are from either the late 19th, early 20th, like before the Second World War. This is a much later item, as you can see, from the 80s, but we couldn't not include a copy of the Vorwärts in an exhibition on Yiddish New York. This is the longest running Yiddish newspaper in the world, founded in 1897. It only went out of print in 2019, and it is still printed in Yiddish online, published in Yiddish online. I've written articles in there. Michal, I know you have as well. I'm sure lots of people here have. A really important publication and very closely connected to the founders of the Workers' Circle as well, as a socialist publication. And again, we're going to talk more about the Jewish left and about socialist Yiddish culture in New York, as well as the importance of New York as a center of Yiddish publishing, the Yiddish press, Yiddish literature. It's very important to talk about the importance of New York for the Yiddish theater. New York was home to the first Yiddish theater district, the Jewish Rialto. You can see a picture. This on the right is one of the posters that we've used to kind of decorate the walls of the exhibition that came from the New York Public Library collections, Der Grüner Bocher, the immigrant young man, the green young man. There's a lot of references in this exhibition to greener people. I think in English, or in American English, you say greenhorn. It's probably not the most politically correct term, although I don't fully understand it, but this way of referring to new immigrants. And here you can see as well something that's interesting. This is an actress playing this Bocher, this young man. There are quite a few examples in the exhibition of JTS's huge collection of Yiddish music from the Yiddish music halls and the Yiddish stage. We've tried to include in the exhibition some of them that kind of show the contradictions of the space. So on the one hand, as I've said already, in America, and especially in New York, Yiddish-speaking Jews were able to create in ways that they had not been able to in Der Alter Heim. In Russia, in this period, you still needed a permit to perform on the stage, to put on a production. It was very difficult to come by. Michal and others here probably know way more about the history of the Yiddish theatre than I do, but from what little I know that many of the very famous Yiddish theatre troupes in Eastern Europe actually ended up in New York. Goldfaden also was here. And so this is a success story of Yiddish immigration to America, but not everyone saw it that way. And, you know, looking at these, you can kind of see why. There was a lot of breaking with Jewish tradition on the Yiddish stage and in Yiddish cultural production in general in New York. You can see down here at the bottom, production of Der Kleiner Millionär, the Little Millionaire, the Hulala at the top. Molly Picon, obviously Picon, a great star of the Yiddish stage and screen in New York, one of the people who definitely did very much with the freedoms available in America. But as well as the fact that for many Jews moving from the old country, this culture kind of represented the decline of Jewish morality, of Jewish tradition. For some also less concerned with religion, just the decline of Yiddish culture. You know, they're adding all of these English. Hulala is not Yiddish, one might say. And I know many of us are still familiar with those conversations. The Yiddish Yankee Doodle. I wonder how good his Yiddish really was. But we also find in the Yiddish stage and in Yiddish music expression of the difficulties that immigrants faced in America. Oh, we're going to come back to this one later. I forgot I put this picture in here. This is a picture of a production of The Wise Men of Helm in the 1930s at New York, the Yiddish Arts Theatre on 2nd Avenue. And we're going to come back to that theatre. But you can see here, this is, they're imagining the world of the shtetl, and it's a really, really beautiful backdrop and interesting picture here. So yeah, so Yiddish music, a lot of the Yiddish music from New York from this period also expresses the huge difficulties that immigrants face. I'm sure that most people have heard of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in 1911, this terrible, terrible tragedy, disaster. Many Jewish immigrants, like immigrants in general in New York, worked in sweatshops, in the tailoring industry. And on this occasion, a fire broke out in a factory, a sweatshop, where people were making women's shirtwaists. And most of the workers were Jewish immigrant women, also Italian immigrant women and girls. A fire broke out. Some of them were locked into the rooms that they were working in. Others just, there wasn't a proper fire escape. There were no safety precautions. The building was not designed to look after its workers, quite the opposite. And many, many people died. I've forgotten the exact number, but I think it's something around 200 or in the hundreds. And here we can see an elegy that was written to these victims. This was a huge, huge tragedy of Jewish New York that also spurred many, including some of the early activists with the Workers' Circle, into action to try to organize for better workplace conditions. And Jews in New York played a really huge role in the left here, which is what we're going to move on to in a minute. I just wanted to bring your attention to this other song, which is one of the ones I sang at the opening of the exhibition. And I'll sing a little bit for you now. So this is Die Grüne Cousine. I'm sure that some people here already know this song very well, but it kind of encapsulates everything, all of the good and the bad in many ways. It became this very famous song. It's very catchy. It's funny. Well, to an extent it's funny. It's also extremely sad. And it tells this story of a grüne Cousine, a cousin, my cousin who immigrated to New York. Es ist zu mir gekommen a Cousine, schön wie golde Siege, wenn die grüne, beckelech wie reute Pomeranzen, wieselech was betten sich zum Tanzen, beckelech wie reute Pomeranzen, wieselech was betten sich zum Tanzen. I hope some people have started to sing along. So my cousin arrived in New York. Thank you for the heart react. That's probably my partner, Cedric. My cousin arrived in New York, and she was this beautiful girl. She had cheeks like red oranges and feet that just wanted to dance. And then the next verse says she didn't speak, she sang, and she didn't walk. She hopped, she jumped. This, beautiful, excited young person coming to make their life in America. But the song goes on, she has to get a job. The job she gets is a millinery store, which I learned from Yves Sicular, whose band Isle of Klesbos played at the exhibition opening, was a kind of euphemism for prostitution. And years go by, and she's completely ruined. She's wasted away. And in the last verse, he says, now when I meet my cousin and I say, how are you? Sure, everybody remembers what she says if you've heard the song before. Heint ich begegn mein Cousine, und ich sag sie, was machst du grüne? Entfert sie mir mit a krumme Mine. Everyone join in. As brennen soll Columbus is Medina. She answers with this crooked manner. Columbus's Medina should burn. This is you can get a kind of bigger picture, you may have seen it before me, of the kind of biggest case of the exhibition. It's a small space, which also made choosing the items quite challenging, because we're trying to do quite a lot with quite a small space, but I hope it's been successful. And here, one of the first items in this case, I wasn't able to find anything out about this, except I can see that these are song lyrics, and this appears to be a program, probably from an event, maybe where people were able to sing along. But this song, America is a golden land, America is a golden country, very similar theme to the Grüne Cousine, this kind of sarcastic, America is a golden land, it's a golden country, but only if you're willing to exploit others or be exploited. And in this case as well, we blew up a number of other postcards. JTS has a great Yiddish postcard collection. It was difficult to narrow them down, but these are some great ones about the kind of change in circumstances that most immigrants experienced in America. And as you're going to see, it's a bit of a mixture. So here we have, in Vilna is gewesen a Rov. In Vilna, he was a rabbi. In New York is a peddler. So very much, well, not really a riches to rags, but riches of Jewish learning to rags. And then here we have the opposite story. In der Heim, means in Europe, is gewesen a Schuster. He was a cobbler. In New York, paskend Scheiles. In New York, he's become the rabbi. He's become the one who people go to with religious questions. And this is kind of making fun of the fact that people were becoming secular, or if not secular, no longer what we now call Orthodox. I mean, this wasn't really a term in traditional Jewish life of Eastern Europe. Everyone was Orthodox. People are so quickly acculturating to America that now any new immigrant, even a cobbler, is the biggest expert on Jewish law compared to your average American Jew. Here's another, again, kind of opposite. In der Heim is gewesen a Baltfila. So in Eastern Europe, he was a prayer leader, someone with a very beautiful voice. In America is an Italienischer Tenor. In America, he's become an Italian tenor. So he's not even recognizable as a Jew anymore. I mean, he's obviously doing very well. You can see he's got a nice coat and top hat. But no longer a Baltfila. And this is kind of the story of I always forget the name of the Yiddish film, and I'm so sure someone's going to write it in the chat, but the one that became the jazz singer, or that the jazz singer is based on. Here's a really typical story of Jewish modernity in America and New York. Also for me in London growing up, this was definitely something I experienced. Against Yor is a bartender in a salon in Coney Island. All year long, he's a bartender in a salon in Coney Island. Obviously, that didn't happen in London, but the regular life versus un auf Rosh Hashanah v'Yom Kippur verter chazan in a shul. And on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, he's a chazan in a shul. You can see he's grown his beard back. 2 days a year, everybody's religious. Rest of the year, not so much. So all of these tensions, this New York as this place of great cultural expression, of freedom, of Yiddish culture, but at the same time, the concern that culture was declining, that people were losing their religion, but also a sense of Jewish identity, but also just the extreme poverty and difficulties that most immigrants faced in America. We're now going to talk a little bit about the ways that Jewish immigrants tried to adapt. and ameliorate their conditions. One person who did a lot was Abe Kahan, the founder of the Vorwärts, Jewish socialist, like the founders of the Workers' Circle, did a lot to try and help and educate and organize Jewish immigrants. Another person who produced a whole load of materials to help his newly arriving brethren is a man named Alexander Harkavi. And many of his materials are in the JTS archives. Harkavi also wrote the very first Yiddish English and Yiddish Hebrew dictionaries. And here, whether or not you speak Yiddish, I advise you to have a go at reading a little if it's not too tiny for you. Die Fragen, was me stellt beim Werden a Citizen. Questions that you are asked when you become a citizen. And if you actually look carefully, the questions are not in Yiddish, they are in English. Of how many states are the United States composed? And then underneath it tells you in Yiddish, von wie viele Staaten bestehen die Vereinigten Staaten? And the answer, 44 in this year. Wouldn't help me today. And here's another example of something similar. This is a phrase book, Der Jiddische Lehrer, der Englische Lehrer, the English teacher. And it contains different phrases for different occasions. Here are a few pages that give you some, on the left is a page about writing letters. And again, on the right-hand side, you have the Yiddish, in the middle, the English in Hebrew Yiddish letters, and on the left, the English and Latin letters. I have to write a letter. I'm reading in the middle column. To whom do you write? Oh, sorry, didn't mean to click forward. And I chose this page. This was another huge challenge in curating an exhibition, is you pick the items, but then you have to pick, if it's a book, which page am I going to display? But I thought this was very sweet, and that it describes these challenges. Firstly, that people have moved away from their family. I need to write to my parents. Are they not in this country? No, they are not here. And then also these phrases about speaking English. Do you speak English? I do speak it a little. These are really, these are the phrases that we need in any language. I feel like in most languages, the first thing I learned to say is, I don't understand you, or I don't speak very well. And here is another book produced by Harkavi, a copy of the Constitution von die Vereinigten Staaten, the Constitution of the United States, in Yiddish. And something that was very important to kind of Yiddish-speaking intellectuals was to educate immigrants about their rights, about what was possible in America, because especially in this period, a lot was possible. And here you'll see on the right a familiar looking organization. On the left are 3 examples of some small pocketbook constitutions. I think I must have gone through about 40 of them. And there are even more in the JTS collections. This would be a very interesting research project to look at them all. So these are constitutions of organizations that were founded by immigrants. Many of them are Landsmannschaften, which are organizations, associations of people who came from the same place. And the priority for a lot of these organizations was burial, to secure a burial ground for their members. This was something, so in the Städtlech of Eastern Europe, where many Jews still lived, a very large proportion of those who still lived in the Russian Empire, and many more had kind of been born there and moved to America via other cities, but nonetheless were rooted in this in kind of shtetl life still. There was this tradition of mutual aid. So in most Städtlech, you had associations called chevres, which were just autonomous societies, and they looked after different needs for the residents of the town. So the Chevra Kadisha, which many synagogues still have, would be the association that looked after burial, that helped ensure that everybody had a proper Jewish burial. Then there would be Chevras for visiting the sick, or helping the poor. Often, for example, a Chevra that looked after brides who got a dowry, and various things like that. So this tradition already existed, and people very quickly formed these societies. As I said, there are many of them just in the JTS archives. But they needed to be legal in America. You couldn't just, you couldn't just ask the local Jewish community for permission to bury somewhere. You needed to, they needed to be legal associations. So you can see in the middle of this picture, it's kind of pink. It's one of the materials that was sadly damaged, I believe during a fire in the JTS archives one year. For jeden member, for every member, and then underneath it's saying for every member of circles. I can't pronounce that in the New York way, but you can imagine it. Circles, lodges, associations, organize, all these different kind of organizations, and it's a guidebook to forming a legal association. And these associations, as I said, they offered people burial, help with burial. They often offered a kind of form of health insurance. They often prayed together. They formed a community. They maintained connections with their places of origin. So they would also help new immigrants coming over. And very quickly, immigrants also started to form associations not based merely on where they came from, but based on shared political ideals. So on the bottom left, you can see this very little Constitution und die Vereinigte Kooperative Arbeitergesellschaft. And this was a constitution of an organization that got together, and I believe that it was linked to the Workers' Circle, because I know that it was later linked to the International Workers' Order, whose constitution you can see on the bottom right, which was formed from a split in the Workers' Circle. So I believe in the 1920s, when this constitution was made, it was still linked to the Workmen's Circle, and it was formed to create, to buy and organize cooperative housing in the Bronx, which became a very important, well-known in New York housing project that lasted for years. The Workers' Circle was also one of these organizations. So I actually didn't know this before doing this exhibition, that the Workmen's Circle was founded in the late 19th century, and it began its life as the Working Men's Circle Society of New York, as a specific New York organization. And the founders had exactly in mind to form an organization that would be like a Landsmannschaft, that would offer some of the same benefits, but that would be based on shared progressive ideals and not on place of origin. And it grew very, very quickly. In 1900, it became a national organization with branches all over the country. And by 1925, which is when this beautiful almanac was created, you see a few more copies of these institutions. So in 1925, when this almanac was created, they already had a sanatorium, a hospital for tuberculosis. I actually know someone who's doing the Yiddish Book Center's translation fellowship with me, is working on translating a memoir from this sanatorium written by Daniel Chardonnay. And here you can see the dining room. This is up in the Catskills, where sufferers of tuberculosis could go and rest and hopefully recover somewhat. There was a Yiddish theatre troupe, the Volksbühne, which still survives to this day, although I don't know if it's still linked to the Workers' Circle the same way. Here you can see a great picture of some of the performers. of the Freie Jiddische Volksbühne. In fact, I think there was more than one theatre troupe by this point. Choirs, multiple schools, both for adults and for children. So workers' schools, so that workers could get an education in the evenings, evening schools, summer camps, and so on. Here's some examples of some of the educational materials. Again, some of us are people who are already deeply involved in Yiddish land. This will be familiar, these kind of things, but these are not all. Here's a book on hygiene. Since we've all been thinking about our lungs, and even more so this week in New York, I decided to leave it open on the page about fresh air and breathing. Many Jewish immigrants both lived and worked in very bad conditions, so hygiene is very, very important to educate people about. Here's a very funny picture of how to correctly swaddle an infant. So this is a book on child rearing, again produced by the Workers' Circle back then, and as well as organizing, becoming very active in Yiddish and Jewish culture, and in education and providing services to their members. The Workers' Circle was members of the Workers' Circle were also very in protest movements, in the socialist movement in particular, and in trade unions. Here's a picture of Morris Rosenfeld, the very famous bard of the sweatshop. And on the right, this was quite a rare find, this newspaper, the Avant-Garde. And this was not really, there wasn't a whole lot of information about it in the JTS catalog, so I had to do some digging, but it refers to a cloak makers union and a specific branch. And I figured out by going through some other archives that this is actually a newspaper that was made for a particular branch of the Industrial Ladies Garment Workers Union, and or International Ladies Garment Workers Union, which members of the Workers' Circle were very involved in founding. And at this point, this is one of the later items in the exhibit. This is from 1940. But as late as 1940, many, many branches of this union, which was again a national union, not just New York, still conducted their meetings in Yiddish or in other languages. But you can see just through looking at the collections, most of which are at Cornell University, how involved Yiddish-speaking Jews were in this. It's one of the biggest, most, powerful unions in America. The newspaper itself it's a little weird. It's been written by this guy, H. Aidenland, and basically he's had a fight with everyone in the union, and he decided to make a newspaper about it. So a big hope, and maybe today will be the day. I keep hoping that, his grandchild is going to come on a tour and I'm going to learn more about this guy. It's a very sarcastic newspaper. He printed a speech that he didn't get to give at the union, but still a very interesting find. And this is part of what this project was about, is to document these things so that researchers of, for example, the Jewish left, like myself, know that there's also materials that they should be looking at JTS. Here's another picture from the Grosse Kundes. Here you can see they're kind of satirizing, critiquing this celebration of America, of Abraham Lincoln as the freer of slaves in the US, and talking about Lohnsklaverei, about wage slavery. It's important to note also, and this is something I'm studying at the moment, that immigrant Jews, or Jews of immigrant origin, were extremely involved in the 1930s in the civil rights movement. And many of them, particularly the International Workers' Order, which is what I'm studying at the moment, split with the Workers' Circle in 1930 and joined the communist movement. And You know, this is a very contentious part of the workers' circle history, a lot of painful and complicated history there, but also part of the history of the workers' circle and part of the legacy. Here is another extremely rare publication. When I ordered this up from the JTS archive storage, this was one of the items that was off-site. I was fully expecting to see the Morgenfreiheit, the very famous Yiddish communist newspaper. By the way, both the Morgenfreiheit and the Vorwärts had more readers in the interwar period than their English language equivalents, which is interesting to know. But this is not, in fact, the communist Morgenfreiheit. This is an anarchist newspaper. I couldn't find any information about it anywhere. I don't know if this may even be the only copy. And something that's very interesting about this newspaper is that it was sent from New York and Philadelphia back to Europe. So it really illustrates the importance of America, and in particular New York, as a space of where the Jewish left could organize. Especially after the 1905 revolution, there was huge repression in Russia in particular. So actually, America was very, very important because here people could still publish and they could even send things back to Europe. Another thing that makes this particular newspaper so important and so poignant in the story of Jewish New York is that it came back to New York with a collection of materials that were rescued from the Holocaust. This, you know, after the second and we decided not to go further than the interwar period with this exhibition because of the confines of the space and wanting to tell one story well rather than trying to tell a much longer story not as well. But this is something I always try to note when I give tours of the exhibition is the importance that New York in particular took on as a center of Yiddish culture after the Holocaust when so many other Yiddish centers were destroyed. This is another example of a communist publication. I gave a tour to a group of children the other day and asked them to guess what was happening. And they said that they thought that this was an illustration of a tattoo shop. It is in fact an illustration of the needle worker nailing his foreboss, his foreman, to the table. And underneath is the AFL, the American Federation of Labor. And this is a communist union calling on its members to be united in the fight for their rights. Another very well-known Yiddish communist publication, Der Hammer, the monthly journal associated with the Morgenfreiheit. And I'm speeding through the last few items because I want to make sure we have time for questions. Here's another workers' circle publication, the International auf Yiddish. And the workers' circle did, along with other organizations, later the International Workers' Order after the split, also the Sholem Aleichem Cultural Center, Zionist organizations. There were a huge number of Yiddishist organizations in New York that did a lot to further Yiddish culture, and in the case of these leftist organizations, to also create this Yiddish socialist culture, this leftist secular Jewish culture and identity, which I personally think has a legacy in Jewish life in America that extends well beyond those organizations. You know, the Workers' Circle is still here, and we still go on trip to Yiddishland, and we still celebrate that culture. And some of us, like Michal and I, still teach and study Yiddish. But I actually think that the legacy goes well beyond that. And so I'm going to end on that exact note on the Workers' Circle and this commitment to Yiddish culture. Here's a lovely picture of kids doing garden work at Camp Kinderland. We will not be having a garden workshop, as far as I know, at Trip to Yiddishland this year. Maybe, but nothing planned. This is a gorgeous book of songs, Lieder von Kinderkamp, written by in this case, IWO, but formerly Workers' Circle Yiddish teacher. And a play for children, Das Grüne Ingel, noch einmal Grüne. And in this case, it's a play about immigrant children and children learning to be part of this multicultural society in New York, and something which many of us are Yiddish textbook. And in fact, I'm going to end again with this picture. So this gorgeous picture of the Yiddish stage, the Yiddish Arts Theatre. And the reason I want to end with it is because it actually also is a nice illustration of where the Jewish left and Yiddish culture overlapped. And you won't hear this anywhere else, but I recently discovered, with some help from some various people, that it was in this theater that the first group of American volunteers who were sent by the Communist Party to fight in the Spanish Civil War, this is where they met before they got the boat. And those of you who are coming on trip to Yiddishland will get to hear a little bit more about my research on that. But I just wanted to share that anecdote because I think it's very exciting and interesting. And I will end it there so that we can answer questions because I've spoken for far too long.
No, you haven't. It was really fascinating and wonderful. Thank you, Annie. Wonderful to see these artifacts and to hear the story you're telling through them. And wonderful also to get all these great messages and questions in the chat. People have been sharing a lot of interesting reminiscences, stories of grandparents and growing up in the Jewish left and in New York. One person said, which was interesting, I thought, you were talking about textbooks to learn English. And Paul Shipman writes, Der Jiddischer Lehrer was a book my grandparents used to help with their English and my first exposure to Yiddish, writes Paul Shipman. But we also have some great questions. So one of them, Annie, please comment on the Socialist Monthly Die Zukunft, if it's in the JTS collection, writes Diana Scott.
There are a couple. I know that there are because I've recently donated a couple to the JTS collections. We didn't, the reason not every journal made it into the exhibition is mostly because of the limits of the space. So we mostly chose ones that had kind of pictures because not everybody who's going to see the exhibition will be able to read Yiddish. And also we picked some of the rarer ones as well. But yes, there are certainly a few copies of Die Zukunft in the JTS collections. I can't remember I don't think there's a full run of it.
Yeah, for those who don't know, Die Zukunft was a really interesting Yiddish literary journal, I think one of the first. It means the future. So it's sort of imagining a future for Yiddish culture and thought. How long will Annie's exhibit be on display? Asks Renee Miller.
It's definitely on display until the end of August, and I'm giving another in-person tour this Thursday and again on the 30th of July. I think it may actually be extended now until September, either the end of September. So you've got a while if you want to see it in person.
Terrific. Yes, really worthwhile. I would encourage everyone who is around New York to go see it. Renee also asks, do you know the approximate publication date of the translation of the Constitution?
Approximately, I have the exact date over there, but I won't run off to look at it. I can give it to you later, but approximately I think it's 1880s or possibly 1890s, but late 19th century.
Oh, sorry, one question. This is just a little comment. Annie, if you could stop sharing your screen so we can see ourselves more. Okay, great.
Yes, I just noticed that.
Yes, wonderful. Someone asks, Gail Reed asks, where is the exhibit? So, well, you can tell us, just to remind us. Yeah.
3080 Broadway. on Broadway and 122nd Street at the Jewish Theological Seminary.
Yes, indeed. Diana Scott asks, please repeat the name of the satirical newspaper editor writer, H. Eden ...
Josef Tunkel, I think, the one of Der Größer Kundes. Yeah, and you can read some great work of his in English translation by my friend and colleague Reiser Turner, who has translated some of his comedy for us.
Yeah, he has some really funny sketches.
Mm.
Just funny monologues and things, and yeah, der Tunkeler. And Alice Dvoskin asks, where is Yiddish land? Which could be a sort of philosophical question, or
Wow.
you could be asking about where is the Worker Circle program called A Trip to Yiddish Land. But
the Worker Circle program trip to Yiddish land is in Hopewell Junction in August. We believe it's almost sold out, but there are a couple of bunks. Is that the situation? I don't
believe
know.
so. That's what I heard earlier
Yeah.
from one of our admins.
Yeah, you gotta be dedicated. And Yiddish land is Umatum.
Yes, your partner Cedric writes in the chat, Yiddish land is in the heart, which
Yeah.
I think that's really special. That might be all. Oh, Renee asks, what time is your tour on the 30th?
2 p.m. I believe. You can find it on the JTS website. If it says that it's sold out, just email me and I'll see what I can do. And thank you all for all the comments in the chat. I'm going to try and read them. Something I love about doing this kind of work and giving a tour like this is, and in person as well, that there's just always people who grew up in these organizations that have stories that I could never find in an archive. So it's really wonderful to get to present it and learn from you as well. So thank you.
Someone, Gail is asking about ways people might be in touch with you. Would you like to...
I think someone already put my email address in the chat, but I'll put it back in there again. I'm very happy to be contacted. Please bear in mind that I have about 1 million jobs, so sometimes I am quite slow to reply, but I will reply. And I love getting emails, especially about Yiddish, and my blog I'll put in the chat as well.
Yes, wonderful. Very worth checking out, pullingatthreads.com. I think that should do it. I really want to thank everyone for being here today. Oh, someone wanted to know how to get the recording. I'm not sure about that, but
I think Danielle said it's going up on Facebook, on the Workers Circle Facebook page, so I'd check that out. If not, email email the Workers Circle and ask.
Very good. One last question I'll do. Levana Mizrahi writes in the Q&A, can you explain more about the interest for Yiddish at JTS?
Oh, that's a really good question. I mean, JTS until recently had 2 Yiddish-speaking professors, and there were classes in Yiddish literature with David Ruskis, and my supervisor, David Fishman, is a great expert on Eastern European Jewish history. He does an amazing course here called The History of the Shtetl, which I very much recommend to anyone who is in New York. So there are connections. JTS recently co-hosted a conference on Yiddish in the Heights, I believe, in honor of the legacy of Mordechai Schechter. But JTS in general, JTS is primarily a rabbinic seminary. They have an undergraduate program. The engagement with the Yiddish collections is not so great, and so that's really what this exhibition is trying to do as well. And that's been the bit that's been so exciting for me, I had no idea that there were materials relating to my own research here. You know, I'm always going to the Tammerman Library, the archives of the left. It's really important for, you know, people to know that. So I'm hoping that this exhibition will help to increase that engagement a bit more. I hope that answers the question.
I think so. Well, Ashenim Dank, Alleman, and Ashenim Dank,
Großen Dank,
Annie.
Michal.
Yes, it was a pleasure
What
to
an
be here, to be
honor.
with you all, and to be with Annie and to learn from her. So thank you all.
Okay.
All right.
Seid
Have a good
gesund.
day or a night.
Yeah, depending on where you are.
Yes. Seid gesund.
Seid gesund.